All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, it's afternoon for us. It might be morning for you when you're watching this. Good day to all of you. It could be the middle of the night, but I hope it's not. Anyway, we're really glad to be with you again for Sunday School. We are really excited about the next few weeks, which we kind of teed up a little bit last week, but we're going to be talking about the office of the prophet, the office and role of prophets in the Bible. And we're going to look at the ideas that and the roles that prophets fulfill from the Old Testament through into the New Testament. So we're going to look at a couple of examples of New Testament prophets. And we're kind of coming at it with this question also of, do we have some contemporary prophets? Voices that we ought to be listening to who fulfill these kinds of prophetic roles for us as individuals, as groups of people, particularly as the church. And so we're going to be kind of looking at one biblical prophet and one maybe contemporary prophet, kind of question mark. Is this a prophetic voice for us? Should we listen to this person with this kind of lens on? So today we're going to be looking at the biblical character of Moses, and we're going to be looking at the contemporary character Flannery O'Connell. But Jordan, start us off with a little bit of an overview of kind of prophetic office and where we're going from here.
Sure. So we're going to kind of really nail down on some pretty basic things to start off with. So today we're going to talk about calling. So that may seem like very kind of, well, let's kind of get to the meat. But I think it's really important to understand how did prophets come onto the scene, and what were they tasked with, and how do they fit into sort of the bigger picture of God's story. And I think the calling it's such a key part of the prophet story, because I would encourage you over the next week just to flip through your Old Testament, especially for the major prophets and the minor prophets, to just read the first few verses of some of the prophets. It will say, prophet so-and-so was around in the time of King so-and-so, he was a shepherd and he was called to do X. So someone will give you really detailed specifics on who the prophets were, and some we really don't know anything at all. But I think there's four characteristics that I think all prophetic stories have, and I think there's a lot of symmetry between our own calling and our lives. And so often the prophets are called, and there's this first sort of reaching out from God to them. And after that they're commissioned, so they're given a specific task to do a specific thing over a period of time. So today we're going to look at Moses, that his specific task was to hold Pharaoh to account for the way the Hebrew people were being mistreated in Egypt. So that was his task. He would go to lead them out and do the wanderings in the desert, but his commissioned task by God was to challenge Pharaoh and to confront Pharaoh with injustices that the Hebrew people were facing. And the next two are objections. Moses says, I'm not eloquent, I can't speak. Why me? And he goes to God again and again and again and says, I'm not your guy. You need someone eloquent, you need someone sharp, you need a wordsmith up there. I'm just old Moses. I'm not your guy. And then ultimately have assurance and signs from God. Moses, it was the burning bush that God has called you, Moses, and I will protect you, I will guide you, and I will enable you to do the things I am calling you to do. And I think it's important to say that the prophets are tasked to do specific things. That I think is sort of, for us, in a lot of ways we talk about it, the prophets are kind of removed. They kind of come out of the womb ready to hold people to account. But they're normal people living normal lives. They're shepherds, they're doing whatever. And then Moses was an old guy, and who was called by God. No special story, no special background, that he was the one that was called by God. And I think you can talk this a little bit as well, that the prophets come because God is angry. But also the prophets are a sign of God's love. That God is angry that his people, and this is true for Moses' case, that God is seething with rage that the way the Hebrew people are being treated by Egypt. And his compassion is that he's going to send somebody to relieve them. And you may think, well, why doesn't God just wipe them out? Why doesn't God just be done with it? And I think it's easier to kind of see it in the Old Testament prophets of sort of Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Is that the people have gone astray. They're living a life of hedonism and debauchery, or even good old secularism. That they're living a good life, things are abundant, the economy's going well. Like Solomon says in the time of when Ezekiel had his ministry, that silver was like stones in the street.
Right.
Like it was total boom time.
And there's just a sense of sort of, you've forgotten God. It's not like they were necessarily doing anything that was overtly against Yahweh. It's that, things are going well. Yeah.
And it's, I think, if you can take one thing away from this today, is that simultaneously prophets are a sign of God's judgment and God's anger, but also a sign of his love. Yeah. That they were provided as, that they were sort of the guide to guide people back to center, or hold people to account for the sins that they were committing. But, and especially power structures. That I think it's not just about that this person drinks a little bit too much, this person is doing this sin. It's that there is systemic injustice to the whole people of God that needs to be held to account. Yeah. And often the language is very like evocative, it's very vivid, and it's metaphorical. And I don't know if you'd want to speak to anything in terms of why or what are some of the motives behind the language being of that nature. But often the prophets do go to the king Darius, they go to Pharaoh and says, you've done X, Y, and Z wrong. Like it's very explicit. Yeah.
So sometimes it's very explicit, and then other times it's more kind of metaphorical. I think both of those things speak to the fact that the prophetic message is a difficult one to deliver, and so because it's a hard message to hear, sometimes we need that put in very explicit terms. You're doing X wrong, or this is X that is against God's law, or whatever it is, explicitly put. But then sometimes we need it like actually put in the form of a word picture of some sort of like you are jars of clay that are about to get smashed, or
God asking a prophet to marry a prostitute.
Yes. Hosea's story is one that is filled with metaphor and imagery about the people of Israel. Even the prophet Nathan, who comes to David after David commits adultery with Bathsheba, Nathan comes and gives David this story about a guy. David's like, this guy needs to die, and then Nathan's like, you're that man. It's like, David, how are you not getting it? This seems like the most obvious metaphor, but that's how the prophetic message is often delivered. Sometimes in those very explicit terms, and sometimes in more of pictorial imagery.
I'm going to talk about this more in the sort of the second half of this, in terms of who are contemporary prophets. And often we think of Aldous Huxley, we think of George Orwell, that these people that paint these apocalyptic, dystopian pictures of the future. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's through literature can evoke within us our longings and our desires, and it can kind of expose to us our blind sides of where we've missed God or where we need God. So just a little like example for those 4 points there, of the calling, of the commission, of the objection, and the assurance. We're just going to read from Exodus some of Moses' story and see if you can figure out where these 4 points comes. This is from Exodus 3, and I'm going to start in verse 7. And this is God speaking to Moses, the Lord speaking to Moses as the burning bush. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them up out of this land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing of milk and honey, at the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, and Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you, Moses, to Pharaoh, to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And the objection in the next verse, Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And then we go later to the next chapter when Moses is in the temple, or at the court, and God asks him to put his hand inside his cloak, and he pulls it out, and his hand has leprosy. And God asks him to put his hand in again, and it's healed. And then there's a sign with the staffs and the snake when he goes into Pharaoh's court. That there's all these signs that God is with him, God will protect it. But that's sort of
the burning bush, as you mentioned.
Exactly. These are the signs of the calling, the commission, the objection, and the assurance. Any more you want to add on that, and how that kind of plays out, maybe with some of the disciples even, of sort of how this kind of 4-step mirrors a lot of our own journey.
Yeah, no, I think you're right to point out that all four of those calling, commissioning, objection from the prophet. It's important to note sometimes in the prophet's stories, the objection actually comes from the people.
Right.
Sometimes the prophets just immediately accept the commission God's given them. They go to deliver the message, and then the objection comes from the people, and then assurance and signs come in different ways. So it doesn't always look just like this, but Moses is such a good example of the Moses story of all four of these things. And I also want to point out, just in thinking about Moses' story, particularly here in Exodus 3 and 4, that as Moses goes through this kind of bargaining, negotiation, objection, assurance dance with God, which is what it is. It's like 2 chapters of Moses going back and forth with God. We have that very tension that you were mentioning earlier between God's judgment and wrath and anger with God's mercy and love. Moses and God go back and forth, and Moses eventually like runs out of objections. God's answered every objection or given him a sign or an assurance of every single objection that Moses gives. And then at the very end of it, Moses still says something to the effect of, all right, God, I've run out of objections, but pardon your servant, choose someone else. Like Moses' words in the English Bible are, pardon your servant, choose someone else. Which is wild that like they went through this whole thing and Moses is still like, I'm not doing it, I'm not the right guy. And the very next verse then says, the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And then the Lord responded to Moses by saying, what about your brother Aaron? Why don't I make the two of you a pair? Aaron speaks well. Aaron can speak for you, and you will be for him like God. So Moses, you're still going to be the prophet. You're still going to be the deliverer of the message. You'll just deliver it to Aaron, and Aaron will deliver it for you to Pharaoh. So the tension is there for me in the sense that the Lord's anger burns against Moses, and what the Lord does for Moses is not smite him. He gives him a way out, which is wild to me. Like I might expect some form of like God runs out of patience. Moses, you've given me too many objections, and now you're just throwing your hands up and saying, choose someone else. Okay, fine, I'll choose someone else. Done with you, Moses, I'll go and choose someone else. But instead, the Lord's anger burns against Moses, and he gives Moses a way out. Like that, for me, is a beautiful picture of that tension between God's anger and judgment and God's mercy and love being held at the same time. Yeah.
That's powerful. And then transitioning a little bit into how this kind of like plays out in the contemporary world. What do you see? How do I think we're going to talk a little bit about how do the prophetic voices in our culture call us, or how do they? I think awaken is a good term to use. And what are some of the ways in which you think contemporary prophets, and we're using that as kind of a very big term, awaken us today?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, it's been important for me to notice that some people have been prophetic voices in my life, even if they didn't know they were prophetic voices. So in the sense of like God's calling Moses here, I do think there are some people, particularly who have an understanding of themselves as being a part of God's mission in the world today, who see themselves as having some sort of prophetic office or role, or where I know of lots of preachers who might think of their preaching has some prophetic edge to it. You know, I'm telling the truth, I'm delivering a difficult message. There's something prophetic about that in this sense of biblical prophets. So there are some people who understand their calling more explicitly like that. But I think there are also prophetic voices, we're going to kind of talk about one in a moment, who may have not even seen themselves as prophetic in any way, particularly not like a prophet for God, but whose voice maybe is evocative in the way the prophets' voices are. Gives us some imagery and some words for something that we maybe wouldn't be able to articulate for ourselves, or that shows us a blind spot of our own that we then need articulated, that they've articulated for us. That we can now recognize and maybe do something about. If it's a blind spot, particularly to do with our sin of one sort or another, something we're not doing right. So I think that's important to understand that I think in our contemporary world, we can have prophetic voices who explicitly know that they are being prophetic. Those people are often found inside the church. And they might even be resistant, objectionary to their own prophetic call. But then we might have people outside the camp who also have that kind of prophetic
Yes.
role, but we need to recognize that because they're not really recognizing it for themselves.
For sure. So, and I think for us is, like, who are the voices that seem to tap into a longing, and who are the voices do we kind of feel just drawn to, like that might be speaking something into the cultural moment we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And I think often these voices are kind of outside of the camp. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Flannery O'Connell, and she's by no means, she's an example, and it's not like this definitive list. And I'm sure you might have some people that you feel really speak to you, and so I think it'd be helpful for you guys to shoot us an email to let us know who are some of the other people that come to mind with what we're talking about here. And I think so. Flannery O'Connell, she was from the South, the deep South. And her writing period was like the 30s to the 50s, 1930s to 1950s. And she's from the South, she's a woman, and she's Catholic.
Yeah.
So like three kind of things where you don't really expect sort of the intellectual, like rich writing to come from. You might think like the Northeast or something at that time period.
Sure.
And she's a farmer. She's like not educated, and to the extent that you would expect for how powerful her work has been. And she's Catholic. And to say that we just don't traditionally go outside of the camp to really engage. Where her voice has been massively powerful, and she's sort of in this renaissance just now, where people say that she's really speaking into this cultural moment of how quick our lives are, how distracted we are.
She died young.
Of
lupus. Yeah, she was 39 when she died of lupus. So there is that kind of. Well, scripturally we talk about like our life being a mist, but you're right, that sort of quickness.
And it's like sort of the people that speak into this moment of about being more present. It's like there's so much of Flannery O'Connell and that kind of spirit into it. So I'm going to read one quote here. All human nature vigorously resists grace because grace changes us, and the change is painful. At best, our age, this is her age, is an age of searchers and discoverers, and at worst, an age that has domesticated despair and learned to live happily with it. I read that and I was like, whoa, that cuts pretty close to the bone.
Yeah, the idea of, I mean, again, she's using words that are just helpful for the imagery.
Yes.
It's the idea of like we've brought despair into our homes to domesticate it.
Mm-hmm.
We brought despair into our homes and become familiar with it, so familiar with it that we've allowed it to live happily with us.
Right.
And I see in that, like in that last phrase in particular, the challenge that we've given up hope. So like to welcome despair in and to live with it happily is at the same time to sort of leave hope outside the house, like to reject hope in a sense. So there's a challenge to me in that like I can look around in 2020, not 1940 or whenever she was writing this. I can look around in 2020 and think, yeah, it's very easy to be despairing. It's very easy to see like and to sort of throw up my hands and say it's all going to hell in a handbasket, there's nothing I can do, I will just be content with watching the world burn, which is to give up hope. Like I think that's easy in 2020, as easy as maybe it was in 1940 to allow ourselves to domesticate despair.
Right. And I think especially just how the thing that impacted me was that similar things to what you were saying there, but also how difficult grace is. And in order to really be transformed, you have to hold up your hands and say, I'm willing to work through the painful things, difficult things. And I think that's very similar to what the prophets call people to. Has said, God has sent me as an act of love to turn you away. But if you want to turn back, there's going to be a lot of work to do. And that might be personal, and it might be really challenging some systemic things that makes our country or makes their country unjust and unfair to lots of people. And it's not going to be peaches and cream and unicorns and rainbows. It's going to be hard work, and it's going to be difficult, and it's going to be upsetting because you're going to have to be introspective and say, what are the things I hold dear? Are they in step with kind of God as the North Star? And then reflectively on our families, on our church, on our country of like, we're going to have to ask ourselves some really hard questions. And I think that's what the prophetic kind of guides us toward is to really wrestle with those deep questions.
Yeah. I've got one quote as well.
Please.
From Flannery O'Connell. It just not that long ago, there was a prayer journal of hers that was discovered from some time she spent in Iowa when she was doing kind of a creative writing workshop type of thing. I'm sure it wasn't called that in the 40s, but it was that.
Right.
So anyway, she kept a prayer journal during those months that she was in Iowa, and it was just recently discovered. I say recently, in the last couple of decades. But well after she died. And one of the prayers that she wrote, she starts out this way. She says, "What I'm asking for is really very ridiculous. Oh Lord, I'm saying, at present I am a cheese. Make me a mystic immediately. But then God can do that. Make mystics out of cheeses." Which again is just, it's hilarious on the face of it. But in the church, we would maybe use language from the pulpit, like, God turns sinners into saints. And the alliteration's great, but we've heard it so many times that it maybe doesn't strike us that, like, God is the kind of God who transforms lives. But the way she's putting it here is the transformation is to go from being a cheese to a mystic. Maybe you don't want to be a mystic, maybe you do. That's inconsequential to the point I want to make, which is just that, like, this is new language for the same kind of idea, the same kind of transformation that we talk about in church all the time, but we sometimes need it to be evocatively said to us or written to us or spoken to us in order for us to hear it in a different way. So that made me laugh.
And how, like,
turning cheeses into mystics.
And how, like, the contemplative comte, that's what I'm thinking of. And then just how the ability for it to, the permission we have to just wrestle with things and speak things in a context that's specific to her, because she was a dairy farmer.
Yeah.
It's like these things are right on her fingertips. It's her world, it's her vision.
Yeah.
And I think that the similar question would be for me and for you guys is, like, where can we hear God calling us to change in our lives this week? And then I think seeing the prophets not as these sort of people in the jungle with machetes, like, hacking a path for everybody else to follow, I think it's much more like they were like you and they were like me. They were normal people living a life that were called to this ostentatious task, which is to redirect and to guide God's people.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, at some level, that's what we're all called to do. Whether it's with your family, whether it's with your friends, whether it's with your colleagues, the prophets were just asked to do it on a bigger scale.
Yeah. And
they're given a bigger task. But I think it's the same task that every Christian, every Christ follower has been given, is how do we reorient our own life towards God, and how can God use us to reorientate those around us towards Him? To be active agents of change, of bringing the kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah. It's good.
Yeah. And I do think that, and we didn't, this is off-piste right now, that I think that the prophetic voice will become more and more important in the West as sort of civic and government engagement with the church continues. As the church becomes more sort of sidelined and maligned, I think the prophetic voice is going to have to become stronger. Because the church has been more like kings. That there are people that have power, the people that have authority, but now it's sort of becoming like a little bit more marginalized.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be language we're going to have to step into to say that, okay, we might not necessarily have the same governmental power that we used to have. We might not have
influence in society.
We might not have the same like sway and clout. But God's still powerful. God's still in charge. And I think that the prophetic voice is going to be how we engage with culture more. Instead of like dictating, it's going to be more of like from the periphery saying, we think there's another way.
Yeah.
And I think being on the margins saying we think there's another way is much more like Christianity throughout the ages.
Yeah. And many churches, we've talked about this before, but many churches, particularly in Western Europe, have already found themselves there.
Right.
You know, sort of maybe 50 or 75 years ahead of where we will in America, but found themselves in the sort of 2 or 3% numbers rather than the 30 or 40% numbers, which is, you know, kind of the picture of the U.S. still. And so to already look to our neighbors in Western Europe and say, well, how have those churches coped with being put on the margins, and there are many good examples in Western Europe of having that sort of peripheral voice that still says, no, this isn't right, or all three of these positions aren't right. If we're talking about political parties or whatever we're talking about, still being able to speak into what's going on in society.
And I think for me it's fascinating that when you don't have power, you don't have anything to lose.
Sure.
And I think a lot of the trouble, or a lot of that the church has got itself into, is trying to protect the power that it has. And it's political power. It's not the power of God to change and transform the world and people through that.
Yeah, it's good.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for tuning in, whatever time of day that is. And we look forward for you joining in again next week. And we are this Sunday having our first in-person service, which we're very excited about in a long term. It's going to be, every other pew is going to be roped off, masks will be worn, you'll be sitting in family groups, there'll be Dr. Rains is going to have a water gun filled with hand sanitizer, so it's going to be clean, it's going to be great, and we really look forward to seeing you in person. And as we said, Drew and I will continue this series online and record it, so those of you who aren't able to come in person can still engage with it. But thank you for joining in, and please email us with some of the voices that you feel are prophetic in your life just now.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great week.